I woke to the soft California sunlight filtering through the vineyard-facing windows of my home, expecting the familiar ping of a text or the chime of a call. It was Mother's Day. And after all the years, I still anticipated at least a simple Happy Mother's Day from Olivia. The phone lay silent on the counter. No messages, no forwarded memes, no calls, not even a vague thinking of you from last-minute rushes. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma normally comforting, now tinged with unease. I refreshed my notifications obsessively, as if sheer will could make a text appear. Maybe she was busy, I told myself. Perhaps setting up some surprise brunch or catching up with friends before the wedding. Chaos swallowed her. I tried to laugh quietly at my own overthinking, but the tightness in my chest refused to ease. By mid-morning, I found myself wandering from room to room, replaying the countless mornings I had woken early to prepare her favorite breakfast or drive her to school, remembering the small gestures that had been the foundation of our relationship. I couldn't shake the hollow feeling, the creeping doubt that something had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, while I had been living in my routine of care and devotion. Finally, around 11:30, I lifted my phone, hands trembling slightly, a small knot of dread forming in my stomach. I opened Instagram, almost afraid of what I might see, and froze, my coffee forgotten on the counter. As the day's silence suddenly revealed its reason, I scrolled through Olivia's feed with a sense of cautious hope, telling myself that maybe it was just a brunch photo or a harmless meme she hadn't sent me yet. My fingers paused mid-scroll when I saw it. There she was, smiling, champagne flute in hand, arms wrapped around Denise, her mother-in-law. The caption glared at me like a spotlight. Happy Mother's Day to my real mom. Couldn't do this wedding without you. I froze, unable to blink. The words hit harder than I expected. Real mom. Not a joke. Not a fleeting lapse. My coffee had gone cold on the counter, my heart thundering in disbelief. Years of love, of late nights helping with homework, of careful financial planning and sacrifices, reduced to nothing more than a footnote in her social media aesthetic. Without thinking, my fingers typed before my mind could process. Your real mom can pay for the wedding too. I stared at it for a full minute, stunned by my own impulsive reaction. Then I hit send. The post disappeared 5 minutes later, deleted as if it could erase the humiliation. But I wasn't willing to let this vanish into digital ether. I took screenshots immediately, her smile, the caption, the timestamp. I didn't send them to Olivia, or to Ethan, or to anyone else. I sent them to Carol Hensley, my longtime lawyer. This wasn't just a social media mistake or a teenage-like oversight. It was public, deliberate, and cutting in a way that demanded attention beyond emotional reaction. I sank into the chair by the kitchen table, staring at my phone as if it could explain the betrayal. The day I had anticipated with light-hearted hope had transformed into a reckoning. I realized that whatever had been shifting between us for months had now made itself public, and I couldn't ignore it. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the phone down. This wasn't just about heartbreak. This was about boundaries, about respect, and about making sure that no one, least of all my own daughter, could rewrite my story without consequences. I remembered the morning my husband had died like it was yesterday. Though Olivia was only 7 at the time, it had been a Wednesday, an ordinary day that became unbearable in the span of a few hours. I was 42, suddenly alone with a child whose world had shifted as drastically as my own. There were no instructions for raising a daughter without him. No manual for navigating heartbreak while still paying bills, feeding, and comforting a little girl who didn't understand why her father wouldn't come home. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, waitressing in the evenings, tutoring during the day, and managing what little savings we had for school and extracurricular activities. Every science fair, every field trip, every heartbreak she experienced, I was there. When she scraped her knee or cried over a failed test, I held her hand through it. I was proud of her curiosity, her resilience, her small triumphs and stubborn independence. When she got older, I took a risk on an accounting certification, hoping to provide more stability for us both. I balanced overtime and coursework with school plays, recitals, and college applications. The years blurred into late nights at the kitchen table, signing checks for tuition, paying for AP exams, organizing summer programs. And when Olivia became engaged, I felt pride swell pride at her finding someone she loved, someone who would share her burdens. I promised to help however I could. That help came in the form of deposits for the wedding venue, catering, decorations, and the endless little extras she insisted would make her day perfect. I never reminded her of each payment, each transaction, each sacrifice. It was my role as a mother, as the person who had built a foundation for her life from scratch. And yet, somewhere along the way, the simple act of giving had been misconstrued as entitlement. My patience, my love, my labor, they were no longer appreciated. They were expected, and now publicly displaced by a photograph and a caption. I stared at the kitchen counter, still gripping my phone. The images of that Instagram post seared into my mind. The years I had poured into her life, the nights I had stayed awake worrying or calculating, suddenly felt invisible. And in that moment, I realized that the time for silent devotion was over. It wasn't just the Instagram post that stung. It was the accumulation of small exclusions over the past year that suddenly made sense in a painful pattern. I remembered the bridal shower I had never been invited to, supposedly a casual gathering just for the girls from work. I had found out about it through a social media post. Olivia smiling in a sash, surrounded by 20 co-workers in matching robes. There had been no call, no text, no explanation. Then there was Biscuit, her little dog. She had asked me to watch him while she and Ethan went to Miami for 2 weeks, promising it would be easy. I rearranged my schedule, canceled a book club meeting, and even bought special hypoallergenic treats. When they returned, the acknowledgement had been a joke about how I owed her for enjoying the dog without paying vet bills. I had smiled through the teeth, pretending it didn't matter, though the weight of it had settled in my chest. Even in day-to-day interactions, I noticed the subtle shifts. Conversations became transactional. Olivia called only when she needed something. Emails were brief. Texts perfunctory. The warmth, the gratitude, the simple moments that had defined our relationship when she was younger had thinned until they were almost invisible. Looking back, I could see that each slight had built upon the last. At first, I excused them as oversights, misunderstandings, or the stress of wedding planning. But now, with the public humiliation of that post, the pattern was undeniable. Each exclusion, each dismissal, each calculated moment of forgetting pointed to the same truth: my role in her life was being minimized, quietly, but deliberately. The realization settled over me like a shadow, and I knew I could no longer ignore it. The years of devotion, the sacrifices, the silent labor, they demanded recognition, or at least protection. It was time to consider my next steps carefully, to prepare for what would come. By mid-morning, I had calmed enough to think clearly. The shock of Olivia's post had faded into a simmering determination. I knew this was no longer a matter of hurt feelings. This was about boundaries, about ensuring that the years of my labor and sacrifice weren't erased by a social media caption. I picked up the phone and called Carol Hensley, my longtime lawyer, who had guided me through the probate of my husband's estate and countless financial matters since. Carol answered immediately, her voice calm but sharp. I explained the situation briefly, emphasizing the Instagram post, the deletion, and the years of financial support I had provided for Olivia and Ethan's wedding. I didn't allow myself to linger on the heartbreak. I focused on the facts. Carol's response was measured. She told me we would document everything, organize it, and establish the legal leverage I needed to protect myself. I spent the afternoon gathering every record I could find. Receipts from boutique dress fittings, invoices for catering tastings, payments to florists and calligraphers, deposits for the vineyard venue, even email confirmations of Olivia's RSVPs to vendors. I cross-referenced them with bank statements and credit card records. Noting amounts and dates meticulously, each entry reinforced the reality I had been responsible for the wedding's foundation, and yet I had been treated as invisible. By evening, the pile of documentation was substantial. But more than that, it represented clarity and power. I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was preparing strategically. Every number, every email, every acknowledgement became part of a shield I could wield if necessary. I wasn't looking for revenge. And I wasn't trying to humiliate Olivia. I was setting firm boundaries, establishing accountability, and making sure that my contributions could not be ignored or exploited further. As I closed my laptop, the weight of the day shifted. The decision to act was no longer hypothetical. I had begun moving from silent frustration to calculated empowerment, from emotional pain to methodical preparation. The next step was clear. I would need to confront this situation directly, but only after ensuring that I was fully armed with the facts and the legal support to back me up. Chapter 6. Emotional Shift to Power. I sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, reviewing the spreadsheet I had compiled. Every line, every payment, every acknowledgement of my contributions to Olivia and Ethan's wedding was recorded in precise detail. The more I looked, the clearer it became my generosity had been taken for granted. My patience mistaken for weakness. Years of love, devotion, and financial sacrifice had been quietly exploited, and the Instagram post was only the most public expression of a pattern I could no longer ignore. I organized the records into categories: deposits for the vineyard, catering and menu tastings, floral arrangements, dress fittings, and all miscellaneous expenses that had added up silently over months. I noted every date, every vendor, and every correspondence confirming my role in making Olivia's wedding possible. These were not gifts or spontaneous acts of kindness. They were contributions that deserved recognition and accountability. Once the documentation was complete, I shifted my focus to strategy. I could feel the emotional weight of betrayal pressing in, but I forced myself to step back from the hurt. This was no longer about outrage or resentment. It was about leverage, clarity, and control. I considered the upcoming wedding planning meeting, the neutral setting where vendors and coordinators would be present. It would be the ideal place to assert boundaries without creating spectacle, to ensure that my contributions and expectations were clear to everyone involved. I rehearsed my approach silently, imagining how I would communicate the limits of my involvement. No raised voices, no arguments, no unnecessary confrontation, just facts, documentation, and the authority that came from careful preparation. For the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet sense of power, rooted not in anger but in strategy. The realization settled over me: meticulous planning and measured patience could be more potent than any emotional outburst. I was no longer reacting to Olivia's disregard. I was preparing to shape the outcome on my own terms. Tomorrow, I would begin the next phase. I arrived at the vineyard early, slipping past the front desk and taking a seat in the glass-walled conference room. The view of the rolling grapevines, normally brought me peace, but today it felt like the perfect vantage point for clarity and resolve. I had not informed Olivia or Ethan of my presence, and I did not intend to. The meeting was scheduled for vendor payments and final planning details, and I would use the setting to ensure my boundaries were respected when Olivia and Ethan walked in. Their composure faltered almost immediately. Olivia's polite greeting faltered, a subtle flicker of surprise crossing her face as she saw me seated with a calm, measured posture. Ethan's hand twitched toward the papers in front of him, his unease apparent. I waited for the right moment, letting the silence stretch long enough for them to absorb that I was not here to negotiate as I once had. "Before we begin," I said, voice steady, "I will be withdrawing from all financial responsibilities for this wedding, effective immediately." I slid a manila envelope across the table toward Ethan. Inside were the documents I had prepared: termination of all wedding payments, a formal demand for repayment of the $35,000 loan, an updated copy of my will removing Olivia as a beneficiary, and revocation notices removing me from guest lists and family designations. Olivia's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and disbelief clouding her features. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening as he scanned the envelope. Neither spoke at first, their attempts at composure cracking under the weight of the documentation. I remained calm, letting the facts speak louder than any argument I could have made. Olivia's voice rose slightly, brittle and incredulous. "You can't just do this. This is my wedding." "No," I said, keeping my tone even. "This is your responsibility. I will no longer cover costs or act as a guarantor for decisions you've made without consideration of my involvement." The documents outline what is expected and what will be enforced. Silence filled the room again. They read, absorbed, and finally, a thin veil of panic began to show in their expressions. They had relied on my compliance for years, and now the certainty of my boundaries forced them to confront the consequences of taking my contributions for granted. I gathered my notes and straightened the envelope. The meeting would continue with vendors, but the message was clear: my role had limits, and I would no longer be invisible in their lives. By the next morning, the consequences of the previous day were unfolding. The vineyard venue had canceled all bookings under my name, and vendors began sending confirmations that their contracts were void. The floral arches, champagne towers, and upgraded table decor, all of it was reversed, stripped from the plans I had once supported without hesitation. Every cancellation felt like a statement, a tangible acknowledgement that my boundaries were no longer negotiable. The $35,000 loan to Ethan's business had been formally demanded and logged through legal channels. Accounts were frozen until repayment arrangements were made. I had meticulously documented every transaction, and now the law reinforced what I had only recently claimed with my words and presence. The clarity of procedure replaced the chaos of emotion. The system recognized my stake and enforced it. On social media, Olivia's narrative began to crumble. Her post celebrating her Emil as her real mom was overshadowed by the sudden withdrawal of my involvement and the visible evidence of my contributions. Friends and family who had assumed I was a passive observer started to see the reality. The foundation of her wedding and her lifestyle had been supported by me, and my role could not be dismissed without consequence. Denise, the Emil, gained a clearer perspective as well, her position in the family no longer ambiguous. Sitting at my kitchen table, I felt an unexpected stillness. The tension that had gripped me for weeks began to lift as I recognized the significance of what had been accomplished. I had acted not out of anger, but from a deliberate, measured strategy. My voice had been quiet, but my actions were unequivocal. For the first time in months, I experienced a sense of closure, not from reconciliation, not from apologies, but from having set limits that commanded respect. The weight of years of unacknowledged effort no longer pressed on me in the same way. I had reclaimed authority over my contributions, my role, and my dignity. The events of the past 48 hours were a confirmation that boundaries, once established and enforced, carried power far beyond any argument or plea. Tomorrow, I would continue monitoring the fallout and ensure that every legal and financial matter aligned with the limits I had imposed. Sitting in my study, I reviewed the events of the past week with a sense of measured detachment. Olivia and Ethan had finally been forced to recognize the consequences of taking my support for granted. Their initial shock had given way to cautious compliance, and I could see the shift in how they approached me: tentative, respectful, aware that the boundaries I had set were non-negotiable. I didn't crave an apology, nor did I expect gratitude for what I had done over the years. My focus had never been on recognition, but on fairness and accountability. I had ensured that the financial contributions I had made, the loans extended, and the countless hours of planning and support were acknowledged not through words, but through action. The legal and financial measures I had enacted were a reflection of that principle: respect must be earned, and it could not be assumed. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of decades of effort settle into something tangible and uncontested. I realized that autonomy carried its own dignity, and that asserting control over my own resources and role in my family was not only necessary, but empowering. The emotional turmoil that had dominated my thoughts since the Instagram post had transformed into clarity. I was no longer reacting out of hurt. I was operating from a place of strength and purpose. This clarity extended beyond the immediate situation. I understood that relationships were not defined solely by proximity or shared history, but by the mutual recognition of boundaries and responsibility. My actions had reestablished that framework within my family, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a sense of self-respect that could not be revoked. With the immediate fallout managed and the lessons absorbed, I could finally turn my attention to rebuilding the life I had long supported others in creating. On my own terms, I spent the following weeks reshaping my routine around myself, rather than the demands and expectations of others. My home, once a backdrop for endless errands and preparations for Olivia's life, became a space of calm and intention. I rearranged rooms, tended to the garden at my own pace, and spent mornings revisiting hobbies I had neglected for years: painting, reading, and walking the vineyards without a schedule imposed by someone else. I maintained my boundaries firmly, answering only to those who respected them and disengaging from the constant requests that had once left me drained. Financially, I was secure. Every contribution I had made was documented, accounted for, and now protected. The loan repayment process was underway, and I no longer felt the anxiety that had accompanied unacknowledged generosity. I could invest my time, energy, and money into projects and relationships that offered reciprocity and appreciation. Community involvement became a source of fulfillment. Volunteering at the local library, attending book clubs, and hosting small gatherings with friends who shared my values reminded me that connection did not require sacrifice of dignity. Each interaction reinforced the lesson that respect and love were not obligations, but choices made by those who truly understood the value of another person. In this space of autonomy, I finally experienced a quiet confidence I had not felt in years. My worth was not measured by approval from those who had once taken me for granted. My decisions, my efforts, and my presence were mine to give, not to be assumed or exploited. As I prepared for another quiet evening in my home, I reflected on the path that had led me here, the years of devotion, the confrontations, the careful planning, all had brought me to a place where self-respect was paramount, and life could be lived fully on my terms.